When Shane preached last week, he recalled this verse from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 6, verse 40. A disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone, when he is fully trained, will be like his teacher. Shane used this verse in connection to the gospel being spread outward from the walls of Jerusalem to the ends of the earth, and all of the good that came from the courage and obedience of the disciples to become like their teacher, Jesus. And the process of the gospel spreading to the ends of the earth was the good brought about by a tragic event that occurred in Acts chapter 7. And that event is the defense and martyrdom of the disciple Stephen. And since Luke, the Gospel of Luke, is really volume 1 of what Luke is writing, and Acts volume 2, I'd like to examine the account of Stephen, of his defense in Acts chapter 7, particularly in connection with the words Jesus gave regarding a student and his teacher in Luke chapter 6. And even more so, I want to show why looking at Stephen's sermon and his defense in this chapter will aid us in meditating on and partaking in the Lord's Supper as we gather our thoughts around the table this morning, as well as this message's implications of the cross. Let's look at the heart of Stephen's preaching in Acts chapter 7. This sermon is actually really good for us this morning because if you recall, throughout this entire year, we've been studying in the adult class the history of Israel. And in many ways, Stephen's sermon here to the Jewish leaders is a recap of a lot that we have studied so far this year. In Stephen's message in verses 2 through 19, Stephen recalls the history of the patriarchs and the promises given to Abraham, the father of the Jewish faith, that moves forward with the events of God's promises, particularly in the events of the life of Joseph, when God's people occupy the land of Egypt. It's curious that Joseph, who's given so many chapters of the Old Testament and is recalled so much in the Old Testament of the Bible, is rarely used, his story is rarely recalled and quoted in the New Testament. So when he appears for us like he does here in Acts chapter 7, the point that's going to be drawn is going to be significant. And Stephen makes the point that the goodness of God using Joseph to bring about his plans wasn't accepted by everyone. In fact, chapter 7 of Acts in verses 9 through 10 reflects the very reason that Joseph goes into the land of Egypt and is sold into slavery is because of the jealousy of the patriarchs. The jealousy of the patriarchs who we're told are his brothers. His own people were the ones that led him into Egyptian slavery. But then Stephen continues on with the introduction of Moses in verse 20 of this sermon, who had a heart to bring salvation by the Lord's hand to his people oppressed by the Egyptian nation. But when he attempts to settle a quarrel between two Hebrew brothers, he is actually faced resistance by them. When attempting to de-escalate the tension that exists between two of God's people, in verse 26, they ask Moses, "Who are you to be ruler and judge over us?" When Moses tries to ask the two brothers, "Why do you wrong each other?" in verse 26, their response is neglectful, and they resist the salvation that Moses attempts to bring them. It is at this point that I think it is fair to draw that the Jewish leaders are starting to get at what Stephen is preaching to them. Stephen is preaching the history of God's people's resistance and rejection to the leaders and deliverers that God sent his people throughout history. This demonstrates that not only did the Jews have a history of rejecting their leaders, but these leaders were one of their own. We're told that Joseph's brothers were the ones that sold him into slavery, one of his own brothers, his own people. And Moses, attempting to bring salvation by the Lord's hand, faced resistance by his own people, one of Israel's own. And then this point is driven home by the sort of mic drop moment of the golden calf that is erected by the Jewish people at the first sign of Moses' disappearance at Mount Sinai. And then Stephen spells it out for us in verse 35. This Moses whom they rejected. This Moses whom they rejected. Stephen sums up in the first half of this sermon the continual disloyalty of God's people to those he appointed ruler and judge to deliver his people. And of course, no doubt in Stephen's mind here as he preaches to the people was adding Jesus to that list of Israel's long history. Jesus, a man who came and preached salvation, the coming of God's kingdom, the forgiveness of sins for all. Jesus was truly the ultimate deliverer for Israel, seeking to save them. And all of the nations too, not just the Jewish people, in a new and complete way. But they rejected him too. So now Stephen has recalled Joseph and he's recalled Moses to the people, but I'd like us to keep thinking about how this relates to what we're about to partake in this morning. So not only have God's people rejected and despised the ruler and judges that God had sent them, but they also maintained an incomplete physical, limiting view of the temple and God's presence inside it. Stephen introduces this charge against the Jewish leaders when he recalls the history of the tabernacle in the wilderness in chapter 7, verses 44 and 45. A time when God's people should have revered and feared God being in their midst. But instead, as we all know in the history of Israel, they took advantage of God's presence among them. They carried the Ark of the Covenant into the war like a lucky rabbit's foot, thinking that as a good luck charm, somehow having the presence of God among them would automatically allow them to conquer their enemies. Which, of course, part of the covenant with God was that he would stand for them and he would fight their battles. But, of course, this was dependent upon their obedience and their service to him, their worship to him, and leaning upon him. It wasn't God they were leaning upon. It was the temple. It was the presence of God among them that thought, as a superstition, would give them good fortune. And even more so, they grew complacent in their relationship with God, and they restricted their understanding of God in a localized way in the building of the temple. And that is why Stephen criticizes the Jewish leaders here in verse 48 regarding the temple when he says, "Yet the Lord Most High does not dwell in houses made by hands." This passage is quoted from Jeremiah in the Old Testament when Jeremiah preached against the sins of the people for growing complacent in their relationship with God and his dwelling among them. But we ask, did God not dwell in the temple? Well, of course, God dwelled in the temple. But the difference is this: they restricted God to the temple. They restricted their relationship and obedience to God to the temple. They only felt God in the temple. They only praised God in the temple. They only served him in the walls of the temple. That's why Stephen says in verse 49 that God is not like the gods of the pagan nations, localized to a station, constrained by walls, limited to a city or a people, but he rules over all of heaven and earth. And not only had God's people localized him and restricted their access to him in a misunderstood way of the temple, but they did it when God told them not to do this very thing right from the start at the temple's dedication in 1 Kings 8. When Solomon builds this temple and dedicates it to God, God tells them that he does not only exist, that he is not limited to the temple walls. Stephen's lesson at this point is actually paralleling the life of Jesus in his ministry when he looked at the Jewish leaders and told them that they had turned his Father's house into a den of robbers. Jesus focused his ministry on preaching to the people for their misuse of the temple, just like Stephen is here. What I want us to see is the parallel that exists between Christ and Stephen, in that Stephen is preaching the exact same message that Jesus preached to the people during his ministry. And one final element of Stephen's preaching that parallels the message of Jesus is the persecution of the prophets in verse 52. This charge extended to the Jewish leaders not for their father's sins, but for the same accusation that applies to them too now in what they did to Jesus in crucifying him. This is indicated by Stephen's disassociation from the Jewish people and his language when he shifts the words that he uses from my brothers and our father Abraham at the start of this message to now, you stiff-necked people. You stiff-necked people. You guys, it's no longer us, it's no longer we. Kind of like when a child is being disobedient and the mom calls the husband and she doesn't say our son, right? She calls the dad and she says your son, disassociating from the shenanigans that are going on. Stephen is disassociating from the people for their sin, and it comes to fruition when he charges them with being stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears, as verse 51 indicates. And he said, as your fathers did, so did you. They are just like their fathers. But of course, in some ways, they are worse than the Jewish leaders throughout history. They are worse than their fathers. Whereas the Jewish people were jealous and rejected God's deliverers who were used by God's means, those were merely human men used for God's purposes. But this generation charged with rejecting God himself, dwelling among his people, seeking to be ruler and judge. They despised him, they rejected him. And even more so, whereas the people had a misunderstood view of the temple and they limited God's view and their relationship to him in the temple, Jesus, who was the temple of God, who was God dwelling among them, they rejected him as well. And of course, Jesus being the fulfillment of centuries of messages by the prophets of one come to save, to bring salvation for God's people. By rejecting Jesus, they rejected all of the prophets, the entire history of the prophets. And so the charge continues on and on and on. What we're going to find here is that not only have they done this, but when faced with the power of God to transform the heart of a servant, and by giving his spirit over to a disciple who seeks to love and to be like Jesus, they're going to treat him as they treated Jesus. So to no surprise then, just as Stephen preached the same message that Jesus preached, the disciple is going to be treated just like his master was treated for the message that he taught. Look at chapter 7 and verse 54 of the text here. Now when the Jews heard these things, they were enraged and they ground their teeth at him. They gnashed their teeth at Stephen. Many of us have seen some messages or heard some things said that have really enraged us and upset us, but I doubt there have been many things we have heard that have made us gnash our teeth. In other words, seeking the life of someone for the message that they spoke. But still, Stephen, being full of the Holy Spirit in verse 55 and 56, sees a vision of Jesus standing at the right hand of God. The heavens are open, and Stephen sees Jesus standing at the right hand of God. It's curious that the detail here indicates that Jesus is standing at the right hand of God. Whereas most verses that speak about this indicate that Jesus is sitting at God's right hand or just at God's right hand, Jesus is seen standing here. Some commentators believe that this indicates that Jesus is standing ready to accept his disciple Stephen, knowing that his time was drawing near. Or some have indicated that perhaps Jesus is standing ready to oppose those who oppose his servant in judgment. as was indicated throughout ancient history. That was a common way of judging others, was in standing position. Maybe both are indicated here by the text. But what we do know is that at the sound of what Stephen is saying, the Jewish leaders stop their ears in verses 57 and 58, and they rush at Stephen to drag him out of the city. Imagine hearing a message that you cannot stand, and so you revert to childish tactics, and you cover your ears and you make loud noises so not to hear what you do not desire to. That is what they're doing here. And then they rush at God's disciple and seek to bring him out of the city. They would rather revert to childish games than be faced with the bloodshed of an innocent life on their hands. So they cast Stephen out of the city to stone him in verse 58. On what charges, we may ask? Well, in order to understand what the exact charges were, I will tell you that these mirror the exact charges brought against Christ. If you flip just one chapter back in Acts chapter 6, we see that when Stephen is preaching to the people and he's conducting all of these signs, being full of wisdom and grace and the Holy Spirit, in verse 11 of chapter 6, they secretly instigated men who said, "We have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and God." And then just 2 verses later in verse 13, they set up false witnesses who said, "This man never ceases to speak words against this holy place and the law." This holy place, that is the temple. Verse 14, "For we have heard that this Jesus will destroy this place, and we will change the customs that Moses delivered to us." The charges brought to Stephen here are the exact charges brought against Jesus in the Gospels, which for the sake of time we won't look at this morning, but we recognize that Jesus was charged continually with blaspheming against the teaching of Moses and the law, and of course his statement about rebuilding the temple after its destruction in 3 days. The same charges brought against Stephen drove the Jews to bring him outside the city to stone him, just like the Jews who treated Jesus the same, and dragging him outside the city to the place of the skull to take his life. So Stephen preached like Jesus preached. He was treated the way that Jesus was treated, but now we're going to see Stephen respond the way that Jesus responded. Stephen's message here, this sermon, was not law-centered or temple-critical, but rather this message was a people-critical message that was based on the standard of the law and the prophets to call attention to the uncircumcised, stiff-necked hearts of Israel. Much like the same message of Jesus regarding the hearts of the Pharisees and the scribes who tainted the law, manipulated their understanding of the temple, and misunderstood the message of the prophets. Ultimately, both servants of God, Jesus and Stephen, were treated the same way for their messages. But not only this, we're going to see that the student responds the same way that his master responds to such evil. Look at the words of Stephen at the end of this section of Acts chapter 7 and verse 59 to see the words of Stephen as his life begins to fade away. "And as they were stoning Stephen, he called out, 'Lord Jesus, receive my spirit.' And falling to his knees, he cried out with a loud voice, 'Lord, do not hold this sin against them.'" He says, "Lord, receive my spirit, and do not hold this sin against them." So it should be no coincidence for us this morning as we turn back to Luke chapter 23 and look at the cross and look at the words of Jesus at the end of his life when his own life is beginning to fade away. In Luke chapter 23 at the cross, Jesus says in verse 34, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And then just a few verses later in verse 46, Jesus, calling out with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." The disciple, Stephen, was truly ready. He had passed the test. He had become like his teacher. So our point today as we gather around the table and as we begin to partake of these emblems, we are doing so much more than simply remembering Jesus' death and what he went through. As we reflect, we commune together with Christ by denying ourselves and taking up our own cross. We're not only remembering him today, but we are recognizing our role to become like Jesus. And the specific way that we do this in the example of Stephen is by forgiving like Jesus forgave. And so for us, the Lord's Supper is not only a reminder of what Christ did for us, but how we become like Christ in extending forgiveness to others. And so today, as we take the bread and we drink the cup, we are remembering Jesus who was sent by God, one of our own. And he is the temple of God. And as we commune with Jesus, we not only are remembering him, but we are imitating him. Like Stephen, we're learning to trust each day like Stephen trusted, and forgive like Stephen forgave, knowing that we are drawing nearer and proclaiming his death until he comes. We can also trust like Stephen trusts in the face of suffering, for we know that we have hope in proclaiming his death until he comes, just like Stephen did here in Acts 7. And so reflecting on Jesus as we partake should make us trusting like Stephen was trusting, forgiving like Stephen was forgiving, and hopeful like Stephen was hopeful. Let us partake.
The trays out and the two cups are stacked on top of one another. If you'll just take the cups and we're going to pass the trays out, and then I'll come back here and lead the prayer for the bread.